I never thought at 74 I'd be the one person standing between my husband's empire and complete collapse. For 50 years, Leonard dismissed my engineering insights with patronizing smiles, treating my structural expertise like a quaint "Harby, that's nice, dear," he'd say when I pointed out flaws in his building plans. Leave the real work to the professionals. But yesterday, when his luxury high-rise partially collapsed and investigators started asking questions about structural integrity, everything changed. Now, Leonard sits across from me at our kitchen table, desperate and trembling, asking for my professional license to retroactively certify his shortcuts. The irony tastes bitter as morning coffee, but here's what keeps me awake at night. Do I save the man who spent decades silencing me, or do I finally let the truth speak? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning light filtered through our kitchen window just as it had for the past 30 years. Casting familiar shadows across the granite countertops Leonard had insisted on during our last renovation. I watched the steam rise from my green tea, a ritual I'd maintained since my mother taught me the ceremony back in Kyoto, before I crossed an ocean to build a life in America that would become something entirely different than I'd imagined. At 74, my hands still move with the precision that once calculated load-bearing requirements for bridges and civic buildings. The same hands that Leonard would pat dismissively whenever I tried to contribute to conversations about his real estate projects. Engineering is such technical work, he'd tell his business associates with a chuckle. Yuko studied it in college. But she's much better suited to making our home beautiful. I remember the exact moment I stopped correcting him. It was 1987, at a dinner party with his investors. I'd noticed a fundamental flaw in the structural plans for his newest residential complex, a miscalculation that could lead to foundation settling. When I quietly mentioned it to Leonard, he laughed it off. "Darling, you're thinking too much. My team knows what they're doing." 3 years later, that building developed a crack that ran from the foundation to the third floor. The repairs cost him more than my annual salary would have been if I'd kept working. But by then, I'd learned to keep my observations to myself. Our house reflected Leonard's success rather than my contributions. Every room showcased his achievements, awards from the Chamber of Commerce, photographs with mayors and city council members, newspaper clippings celebrating his latest developments. My engineering degree hung in the spare bedroom, dusty and forgotten, like an artifact from someone else's life. The spare bedroom had become my sanctuary over the years. That's where I kept my technical journals, my continuing education certificates, and the professional license I'd maintained religiously, paying renewal fees even when Leonard questioned the expense. "Why bother?" he'd ask. "It's not like you're using it." I never could explain to him that keeping that license felt like keeping a piece of myself alive. My daughter Maya understood, though she'd never said so directly. At 48, she'd built her own successful law practice, partly in reaction to watching her mother's ambitions get folded into domestic expectations. Maya had inherited my analytical mind and her father's determination, but she'd learned early not to let anyone diminish her voice. During our monthly lunches, she'd ask about my old projects, remembering details about the pedestrian bridge I'd designed for the university campus, or the community centre that still bore my structural innovations. "You know that bridge handles more foot traffic than originally projected," she told me last month. I looked up the usage statistics. Your safety margins were perfect. Maya had always been protective of my legacy, even when I'd stopped protecting it myself. Our son Devon had followed his father's path into real estate development, but with a conscience that sometimes made Leonard uncomfortable. At 45, Devon questioned practices his father took for granted, pushing for sustainable building methods and comprehensive safety reviews. He'd inherited my attention to detail without realizing it came from me. Leonard took credit for Devon's meticulousness, calling it good business sense. The irony wasn't lost on me that both my children had absorbed lessons I'd stopped teaching out loud. Leonard himself had become a stranger to me in increments so small I hadn't noticed until the distance felt insurmountable. The young man I'd married in 1974 had been ambitious but respectful, impressed by my engineering degree and curious about my insights. Somewhere along the way, as his business grew and his ego expanded, my expertise had become an inconvenience rather than an asset. He'd developed a habit of explaining things to me that I understood better than he did, particularly anything technical. Last year, when our water heater failed, he spent 20 minutes describing how heating elements work before calling a repairman. I didn't mention that I'd already diagnosed the problem and could have replaced the component myself. It was easier to nod and let him feel competent. The saddest part was how I'd become complicit in my own diminishment. I'd learned to phrase my observations as questions rather than statements. Instead of saying that structural support is insufficient, I'd ask, "Don't you think that beam might need reinforcement?" It allowed Leonard to discover the insight himself and take credit for the solution. But maintaining that professional license had been my quiet rebellion. Every 2 years, I completed the required continuing education hours, studying new building codes and engineering innovations. Leonard saw it as an expensive hobby. I saw it as keeping a door open to a version of myself I'd never fully abandoned, and my morning routine had evolved to include checking engineering news websites and professional forums. I followed discussions about sustainable building practices, seismic retrofitting, and innovative materials. My technical knowledge remained current, even as my confidence in sharing it had eroded. The kitchen where I sat contemplating these things had been designed by Leonard's architect without consulting me, despite my expertise in spatial dynamics and structural efficiency. The island was too small for the room's proportions. The cabinet placement created awkward traffic patterns, and the window positioning missed optimal natural lighting. I'd suggested modifications during construction, but Leonard had already approved the plans. "Trust the professionals," he'd said. "They do this for a living." I'd been doing it for a living too, once upon a time. Our garden, visible through that poorly positioned window, represented the one space where my knowledge was not only welcomed, but celebrated. Leonard took pride in showing visitors the landscape I'd designed and maintained, never mentioning my background in environmental engineering or my understanding of drainage, soil composition, and structural integration. To him, gardening was an appropriately feminine pursuit that happened to produce beautiful results. But every plant placement, every drainage solution, every retaining wall reflected engineering principles he couldn't recognize. The garden was my laboratory, the place where I continued to solve structural problems on a smaller scale. When heavy rains threatened to wash out the sloped areas, I'd installed terracing systems that managed water flow more effectively than many commercial developments. When the oak tree near our foundation developed concerning root patterns, I'd designed a barrier system that protected the house without harming the tree. Leonard praised the aesthetic results without acknowledging the technical sophistication. Underlying them, the telephone on our kitchen counter had been ringing more frequently lately. Leonard's business was expanding again, another residential complex in development, another round of investors to impress. I'd overhear fragments of conversations about permits, inspections, and timeline pressures. Sometimes I caught details about structural concerns that made me uncomfortable, but I'd learned not to interrupt or offer unsolicited input. That morning, as I finished my tea and prepared to check on my garden, I didn't know that everything was about to change. I didn't know that Leonard's latest project harbored the kind of structural flaws I'd been spotting and staying quiet about for decades. I didn't know that in 24 hours, my professional expertise would transform from an embarrassing reminder of my past into his only salvation. All I knew was that the morning light was fading into the kind of overcast sky that meant rain, and my garden's drainage systems would get another test of their engineering integrity. The call came at 6:47 a.m., 20 minutes before my usual wake-up time. Leonard's phone rang with the sharp urgency that meant business crisis, and I heard him stumble from bed to answer it in his office down the hall. Even through closed doors, his voice carried the particular tension that meant serious trouble. I lay still, listening to fragments of conversation punctuated by long silences that suggested someone else was doing most of the talking. Words like collapse, investigation, and liability drifted through the hallway, each one landing in my chest like a stone dot. By the time Leonard returned to our bedroom, I was sitting up, fully awake. His face had gone grey in a way I'd never seen before, and his hands trembled as he sat on the edge of our bed. "There's been an incident," he said, his voice carefully controlled. "At the Meridian Heights complex, Meridian Heights." The luxury residential tower he'd been celebrating for months, the crown jewel of his latest development phase, 43 stories of premium condominiums with panoramic city views, marketed to young professionals and empty nesters seeking downtown sophistication. "What kind of incident?" I asked, though something cold was already settling in my stomach. "Partial structural failure. Southeast corner, floors 12 through 15. No one was hurt, thank God. But ... he ran his hands through his hair, a gesture I recognized from our early marriage when he'd been vulnerable enough to show uncertainty. "The whole building is being evacuated while they investigate." I felt my engineering mind automatically engage, running through possible causes. Southeast corner suggested foundation issues or inadequate lateral support. Floors 12 through 15 indicated a failure in the mid-rise transition zone, where structural loads typically required additional reinforcement. "Do they know what caused it?" I heard myself asking. Leonard's pause lasted too long. "They're bringing in independent structural engineers to assess the entire building. The city's involved. There's talk of ... He stopped, unable to finish the sentence, but I could finish it for him. "There was talk of criminal negligence if the investigation revealed code violations or corner cutting in the structural design. There was talk of lawsuits from displaced residents and damaged neighbouring properties. There was talk of Leonard's 40-year reputation crumbling along with his building." The newspaper arrived 2 hours later with the story already making front-page headlines. "Luxury tower partially collapses. Residents evacuated." The photograph showed a section of the building's exterior wall that had simply given way, leaving apartments exposed like a cutaway dollhouse. Emergency vehicles surrounded the building, and residents stood on the sidewalk clutching hastily packed belongings. I studied the photograph with professional eyes, noting details that would escape casual observers. The failure pattern suggested inadequate steel reinforcement in the concrete structure. The way the wall had peeled away indicated poor connection between the exterior facade and the internal load-bearing elements. These weren't random failures caused by unexpected events. These were systematic weaknesses that should have been caught during design review. Leonard spent the morning on the phone with lawyers, insurance representatives, and city officials. I could hear his voice becoming more strained with each conversation. By noon, the house felt like a bunker under siege. Maya arrived without calling first, something she rarely did. My daughter's legal training had taught her to recognize crisis situations, and she walked into our kitchen with the focused intensity she brought to courtroom battles. "How bad is it?" she asked Leonard directly, skipping pleasantries. "Bad," he admitted. "The preliminary engineering report suggests structural deficiencies. They're talking about investigating all my recent projects." Maya's expression hardened. What kind of structural deficiencies? Leonard glanced at me, then away. Issues with load-bearing calculations, steel reinforcement, specifications, foundation integration. He was reciting technical terms like foreign phrases, not fully understanding their implications. But I understood every word. Each item on his list represented a fundamental engineering principle, the kind of calculation I'd learned in my second year of structural engineering courses. These weren't obscure technical details that might escape a developer's attention. These were basic safety requirements that any competent structural engineer would flag immediately. Who did your structural engineering analysis? Maya asked Morrison and Associates. They've been handling our projects for 15 years. I knew Morrison and Associates by reputation. They were a small firm that prioritized speed and cost efficiency over comprehensive analysis. Leonard had chosen them specifically because they rarely challenged his timeline or budget constraints. A more thorough engineering firm would have required additional testing, revised specifications, and extended review periods that Leonard considered unnecessary delays. Maya looked at me for the first time since arriving. Mom, you're a structural engineer. What do you think about this? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Leonard's eyes darted between us, and I could see him calculating whether my professional opinion might help or hurt his situation. I chose my words carefully, without seeing the actual engineering reports and building specifications. It's impossible to make definitive judgments. But based on the failure pattern visible in the newspaper photograph... I paused, meeting Leonard's gaze. It appears to be a systematic structural issue rather than an isolated incident. Leonard flinched. Maya leaned forward. Meaning what? Exactly. Maya pressed. Meaning this probably isn't limited to one building. If the structural engineering firm used similar approaches across multiple projects, and if those approaches involve cutting corners on safety specifications, I let the implication settle. The investigation will likely expand beyond Meridian Heights. The silence that followed felt heavy with 30 years of unspoken expertise. Leonard had spent 3 decades dismissing my professional knowledge, treating my engineering background as an interesting personal detail rather than a valuable resource. Now that same knowledge was illuminating the scope of his crisis with uncomfortable precision. Devon arrived that evening, having driven straight from the company office where he'd spent the day fielding calls from panicked investors and angry residents. My son looked exhausted in a way that went beyond physical tiredness. He'd inherited enough of my analytical nature to understand the technical implications of what was happening. The Morrison firm is claiming their calculations met minimum code requirements, Devon reported, but the preliminary investigation suggests the loads exceeded those minimums. I set down my coffee cup with deliberate care. What kind of loads? Wine loads, primarily. And seismic considerations. Devon rubbed his eyes. The building was designed to minimum earthquake resistance standards, but the investigators think the soil conditions required additional reinforcement. Every word confirmed my worst suspicions. Seismic engineering had been one of my specializations, particularly the interaction between soil composition and structural stability. I'd written papers on the subject during my graduate work, focusing on how local geological conditions could amplify earthquake forces beyond standard calculations. If Leonard's engineering firm had used generic seismic specifications without conducting site-specific soil analysis, they'd essentially built a luxury tower on inadequate foundations. The partial collapse wasn't a freak accident. It was an inevitable result of engineering shortcuts. Did Morrison and Associates conduct soil boring tests? I asked Devon, and Leonard exchanged glances. I'm not sure, Leonard admitted. That would have added significant time and cost to the project timeline. My heart sank. Soil boring tests were standard practice for any building over 10 stories, particularly in our region where geological conditions vary dramatically between neighbourhoods. Skipping those tests to save time and money was exactly the kind of corner cutting that led to structural failures. The television news that evening featured interviews with displaced residents, city engineers, and safety officials. The Meridian Heights collapse dominated local coverage, with experts explaining how structural failures could cascade through entire buildings if fundamental engineering principles were ignored. One expert, a professor from the university where I'd earned my degree, explained the importance of comprehensive structural analysis in terms Leonard finally seemed to understand. Buildings are complex systems, she said. When developers prioritize cost and speed over thorough engineering review, they're essentially gambling with public safety. Leonard turned off the television and sat in silence for several minutes. When he finally spoke, his voice was smaller than I'd heard it in years. How many buildings might be affected? I'd been calculating that number since morning, running through mental lists of his recent projects and cross-referencing them with what I knew about Morrison and Associates' typical practices. Potentially dozens, I said quietly, any building they engineered in the past 5 years would need independent structural review. The full scope of the crisis was beginning to dawn on him. This wasn't about one building or one lawsuit. This was about the systematic engineering failures that could bring down his entire business empire. And for the first time in 30 years, Leonard needed my professional expertise more than he'd ever needed anything else. The engineering report arrived by courier 3 days after the collapse, sealed in a manila envelope marked confidential legal review only. Leonard signed for it personally, his hand shaking as he wrote his name. I watched from the kitchen window as he stood in our driveway, staring at the envelope like it might explode. Maya had requested copies of all engineering documents, exercising her power of attorney for Leonard's business affairs as his lawyer. She needed to understand the technical foundation of what could become massive litigation. But as our daughter, she also understood that I was the only person in the family qualified to interpret what those documents actually meant. "Mom, I need you to look at these," she said, when Leonard finally brought the envelope inside. "I can read legal language, but engineering calculations might as well be hieroglyphics." Leonard hesitated, clutching the envelope against his chest. For 30 years, he'd excluded me from business discussions involving technical matters. Now his survival depended on my ability to decode the very expertise he dismissed. "These are confidential business documents," he said weakly. Maya's expression could have cut glass. "Dad, your business is facing potential criminal charges for criminal negligence. This isn't about confidentiality anymore. This is about understanding whether you need to prepare for bankruptcy or prison." The word prison made Leonard flinch visibly. He handed me the envelope without further protest. Inside were 43 pages of technical analysis that told a story of systematic engineering failures. The independent structural engineers had conducted comprehensive testing of the collapsed building, and their findings read like a catalogue of professional negligence. Load-bearing calculations had been based on outdated building codes. Still, reinforcement specifications were adequate for a 20-story building, but insufficient for 43 floors. Most damning of all, the foundation analysis had relied on generic soil data rather than site-specific geological surveys. I spread the documents across our dining room table, the same table where Leonard had hosted countless business dinners while directing conversations away from technical topics whenever I tried to contribute. Now that polished surface was covered with engineering diagrams that revealed the scope of his crisis. "The foundation is the most serious problem," I explained to Maya and Leonard. "The building was constructed assuming standard soil conditions. But the actual site contains a layer of expansive clay that wasn't accounted for in the structural design. Leonard stared at the soil analysis charts without comprehension. What does that mean? It means the building's weight is distributed incorrectly for the ground conditions. Expansive clay swells and contracts with moisture changes, creating uneven pressure on the foundation. The structural design should have included deep pilings or alternative foundation systems to compensate. Maya took notes while I spoke, her legal training helping her recognize the implications. How expensive would proper foundation engineering have been? I calculated quickly, drawing on knowledge I'd maintained through decades of continuing education. For a building this size, proper soil analysis and foundation modifications would have added approximately $800,000 to the construction budget. Leonard's face went pale. $800,000 represented less than 2% of the project's total cost, but it was money he'd chosen not to spend in order to maximize profit margins. The timeline would have been extended by 3 months, I continued. Morrison and Associates probably presented the foundation shortcuts as an acceptable risk to meet your construction deadlines. Devon arrived that evening to review the engineering reports with us. My son had inherited enough technical aptitude to follow basic engineering principles, and he asked informed questions about load distribution and structural integrity. How many of our recent projects used Morrison and Associates? He asked Leonard. All of them, Leonard admitted. They've been our primary engineering firm since 2018. I felt my heart sink. 5 years of projects using the same firm meant 5 years of potentially inadequate engineering analysis. Every residential complex, office building, and commercial development Leonard had built during that period could harbour similar structural flaws. We need to request engineering documents for every Morrison project, Maya said. I can file motions to obtain them as part of our legal defense preparation. Leonard looked confused. Legal defense. We haven't been charged with anything. Maya's voice carried the patience of someone explaining obvious facts to a child. Dad, when buildings collapse due to engineering negligence, criminal charges are standard. The district attorney is already reviewing the case for potential prosecution. The word prosecution seemed to hit Leonard like a physical blow. He'd spent 40 years building a reputation as a successful developer, earning respect and recognition from the business community. The possibility of criminal charges would destroy everything he'd worked to achieve. What about insurance? He asked desperately. Professional liability insurance typically excludes coverage for criminal negligence, Maya replied. If the investigation proves you knowingly used inadequate engineering specifications, insurance companies will deny claims. I watched Leonard absorb this information, seeing him truly understand his situation for the first time. He'd always operated with confidence that money and connections could solve business problems. But engineering failures weren't susceptible to persuasion or political influence. Physics didn't negotiate. My phone rang unexpectedly that evening, an unfamiliar number with a local area code. The caller identified herself as Nina Morales, a senior building inspector with the city's engineering department. Mrs. Oslowick, I'm calling because your name appeared in our database as a licensed structural engineer. We're conducting investigations related to the Meridian Heights collapse, and we could use additional expertise for our review team. The irony was breathtaking. After 30 years of having my engineering credentials dismissed by my own husband, the city was recruiting me to investigate his building failures. I haven't practiced professionally in many years, I said carefully, but your license is current, and your background in seismic engineering is exactly what we need for this investigation. Would you be available to consult on structural analysis? I glanced at Leonard, who was watching my conversation with growing alarm. Can I call you back tomorrow? I need to review some potential conflicts of interest. After I hung up, the dining room fell silent. Leonard understood what had just happened, even if he couldn't quite process the implications. "They want you to investigate my buildings," he said quietly. "It appears that way." Maya leaned forward, her legal instincts engaged. "Mum, this could be a significant opportunity. If you're part of the official investigation team, you'll have access to all the engineering documents and structural analysis reports. It would also mean investigating my own husband's business practices," I pointed out. "Yes," Maya said without hesitation. "It would." Leonard stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. "This is ridiculous. Yuko can't investigate her own family. There are ethical considerations, conflicts of interest. Actually, Dad, there aren't," Maya replied calmly. "Mom's professional obligations as a licensed engineer supersede personal relationships. If she has relevant expertise, she is obligated to assist public safety investigations." I'd been thinking about this exact scenario without realizing it. For decades, I'd watched Leonard's projects from the periphery, occasionally noticing potential problems but staying quiet to preserve family harmony. Now I had the opportunity to examine those projects with professional authority and official backing. The decision would force me to choose between protecting Leonard and protecting public safety, between maintaining family loyalty and exercising professional responsibility, between staying invisible and stepping into the light of my own expertise. "I need time to think," I said finally, but even as I spoke those words, I knew my decision was already forming. I'd spent 30 years keeping quiet about engineering concerns. I'd watched Leonard prioritize profits over safety, dismiss my insights, and treat my professional knowledge as a relevant hobby. Now buildings were collapsing, residents were displaced, and people could have been killed. The time for staying quiet was over. Leonard seemed to sense my internal shift. His voice carried a desperation I'd never heard before. "Yuko, please, we're family. Whatever problems exist with these buildings, we can solve them privately. You don't need to get involved with official investigations." I looked at my husband of 50 years, this man who'd shared my bed and ignored my brain, who'd built an empire while dismissing the expertise that could have made it stronger. "Leonard," I said quietly, "I've been involved with these buildings all along. I just haven't been allowed to say anything about it." The next morning, I called Nina Morales back and accepted the consulting position. My first day as a consulting engineer for the city investigation felt like stepping into a life I'd left behind decades ago. Nina Morales met me at the downtown municipal building, a structure I remembered helping to design during my early career. Walking through those familiar corridors brought back muscle memory of professional confidence I'd forgotten I possessed. "We've set up a temporary analysis center in Conference Room B," Nina explained as we walked. "We have structural engineers from 3 independent firms reviewing different aspects of the investigation." The conference room buzzed with focused activity. Engineers hunched over laptops displaying structural modeling software, their screens showing 3-dimensional building analyzers that hadn't existed when I'd practiced professionally. Technical discussions filled the air with terminology I hadn't heard spoken aloud in years: moment connections, drift ratios, seismic coefficients. I felt simultaneously at home and like an imposter. Nina introduced me to the team, emphasizing my background in seismic engineering and soil analysis. The other engineers welcomed me with professional courtesy, though I caught a few curious glances at my age. Most of them were young enough to be my children, representing a generation of engineers who'd learned on sophisticated computer modeling systems rather than the slide rules and hand calculations of my era. Mrs. Oslowick will be reviewing foundation analyzers and soil interaction reports, Nina announced. Her experience with local geological conditions makes her particularly valuable for this investigation. The first documents they handed me were soil boring reports for Leonard's Meridian Heights project. As I studied the data, my worst suspicions were confirmed. The reports showed clear evidence of expansive clay layers that required specialized foundation engineering, but the structural plans indicated generic foundation systems designed for stable soil conditions. These soil conditions required deep pilings with expansion joints, I told the team. The foundation system actually used was inadequate by at least 40%. One of the younger engineers looked puzzled. The Morrison firm certified these foundations as code compliant. Code compliant and engineering appropriate aren't the same thing, I explained. Building codes establish minimum safety standards, but they assume engineers will conduct site-specific analysis to determine whether those minimums are sufficient for local conditions. As I spoke, I realized I was teaching again, sharing knowledge that had been bottled up for 30 years. The younger engineers listened attentively, taking notes and asking follow-up questions that showed they understood the implications. By lunchtime, we'd identified fundamental engineering deficiencies in 3 separate Leonard Oslowick developments. The patterns were consistent: inadequate soil analysis, insufficient load calculations, and structural specifications that prioritized cost efficiency over safety margins. Nina walked me to lunch at a small cafe near the municipal building. "You're finding exactly what we suspected," she said. Morrison and Associates appears to have been rubber stamping structural plans without conducting proper engineering analysis. "The concerning part is how systematic it appears," I replied. "These aren't random mistakes or oversight errors. This represents a consistent pattern of cutting engineering corners to meet budget and timeline constraints, which brings us to the larger question," Nina said carefully. "How much did your husband know about these engineering shortcuts?" The question I'd been dreading hung between us like a sword. As Leonard's wife, I wanted to believe he'd been misled by incompetent engineers rather than complicit in dangerous course-cutting measures. As a professional engineer, I knew the evidence suggested otherwise. "Leonard isn't an engineer," I said slowly. "But he's been in real estate development for 40 years. He understands the relationship between engineering specifications and construction costs." Nina nodded. "That's what makes this potentially criminal rather than simply negligent. If he pressured engineers to reduce safety specifications to save money, knowing those reductions could compromise building integrity." She didn't need to finish the sentence. "Leonard could face charges of criminal negligence, reckless endangerment, and potentially manslaughter if anyone had been killed in the collapse." That evening, I returned home to find Leonard pacing in his office, surrounded by stacks of business documents and legal files. He looked up when I entered, his face desperate and pleading. "How was your first day investigating my life's work?" The bitterness in his voice cut through the room. "I reviewed engineering documents and soil analysis reports," I said neutrally. "The same kind of technical work I used to do professionally before. You gave it up to support my career," he said. "Before you chose family over professional ambitions." The accusation stung because it contained enough truth to hurt. I had stepped back from engineering to support Leonard's growing business and raise our children. But I'd never chosen to abandon my expertise entirely. Despite Leonard's years of discouragement, I maintained my professional license and continuing education, I reminded him. "I kept my knowledge current even when you told me it was unnecessary." Leonard slumped in his desk chair, looking older than his 76 years. "The lawyers say I could face criminal charges if the investigation proves I knew about engineering problems. Did you?" I asked directly. The pause lasted too long. When Leonard finally answered, his voice was barely audible. "I knew Morrison was efficient. They delivered reports quickly and didn't challenge our timelines or budgets. Other engineering firms wanted additional testing, extended review periods, expensive modifications. He looked up at me with haunted eyes. I thought they were being overcautious. I thought Morrison understood practical business requirements. I felt my heart break for him and my professional ethics revolt simultaneously. Leonard hadn't intentionally endangered lives, but he'd chosen willful ignorance over responsible engineering oversight. He'd prioritized profits over safety because addressing safety concerns would have been inconvenient and expensive. What about the soil boring reports? I pressed. The Meridian Heights site required specialized foundation engineering. Morrison's reports clearly indicated expansive clay conditions. Leonard's face flushed. Those reports were full of technical jargon. I assumed Morrison would handle whatever engineering adjustments were necessary, but they recommended additional soil testing that you declined to authorize. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Another long pause. The additional testing would have delayed our construction timeline. By 2 months, we had investor commitments and completion deadlines. There it was. Leonard had received professional recommendations for additional safety measures and chose to ignore them rather than extend project timelines. He'd gambled with structural integrity to preserve profit margins and construction schedules. Maya arrived for dinner that evening, bringing legal documents and grim news. The district attorney's office is formally opening a criminal investigation. She announced, "Dad, you need to prepare for the possibility of criminal charges." Devon was already waiting in our kitchen, his face pale with stress. "The company's insurance carriers are threatening to cancel our policies. 3 investor groups have filed suit for fraud and misrepresentation. The family I'd raised, the business Leonard had built, the life we'd constructed together was crumbling as systematically as his inadequately engineered buildings." "How bad is it?" Leonard asked Maya. "Potentially catastrophic. If the investigation proves criminal negligence, you could face prison time. The civil lawsuits could bankrupt the company and force personal asset forfeiture." Leonard turned to me. With an expression of raw desperation, "Yuko, you're part of the investigation team. You understand the technical issues better than anyone. Is there any way to minimize the engineering deficiencies? Any way to present them as honest mistakes? Rather than deliberate corner cutting, the request hung in the air like poison. My husband was asking me to compromise my professional integrity to protect him from the consequences of ignoring professional engineering standards. He wanted me to minimize the very safety violations that could have killed innocent people." Leonard, I said quietly, "You're asking me to falsify engineering analysis to protect you from criminal prosecution." "I'm asking you to remember that we're family," he replied. "I'm asking you to consider what 50 years of marriage means when weighed against technical details that most people don't understand." I looked at this man I'd loved, supported, and watched diminish my expertise for 3 decades. He dismissed my professional knowledge when it could have prevented these problems, and now he wanted me to corrupt that same knowledge to save him from accountability. The choice crystallized with startling clarity. I could protect Leonard by compromising my professional ethics, or I could protect public safety by insisting on accurate engineering analysis. For the first time in 30 years, I chose my profession over my marriage. "I won't falsify engineering reports, Leonard. I can't and I won't." The silence that followed felt like the end of something fundamental between us. The revelation came during my 3rd week with the investigation team, buried in a stack of engineering correspondence I'd requested from Morrison and Associates. Nina had been pushing the firm to provide complete documentation for all Leonard's projects, and their compliance had been reluctant at best. Most firms organized their files chronologically or by project name. but Morrison's documents seemed deliberately scattered, as if someone had tried to obscure important connections. I was reviewing foundation engineering reports from 2019 when I noticed something that made my blood freeze. At the bottom of a soil analysis memorandum, almost hidden in the technical appendix, was a paragraph that changed everything I thought I knew about Leonard's involvement in the engineering failures. The memo was addressed to L. Oslowick and dated 6 months before the Meridian Heights groundbreaking. It detailed specific concerns about soil conditions and recommended comprehensive geotechnical testing before foundation design. But the most damning section was a handwritten note in the margin. Per client request, standard foundations approved despite soil concerns. Client assumes liability for geotechnical risks. Leonard hadn't just ignored engineering recommendations. He'd explicitly instructed Morrison and associates to proceed with inadequate foundations despite their professional warnings about soil conditions. I read the document 3 times before the full implications settled. My husband hadn't been a victim of incompetent engineering. He'd been the driving force behind dangerous course-cutting measures, pressuring engineers to approve substandard specifications against their professional judgment. Nina found me staring at the memorandum an hour later, my hands trembling as I held the evidence that could send Leonard to prison. "What did you find?" she asked gently. I handed her the document without speaking. Nina read it carefully, her expression growing grim as she absorbed the legal implications. "This proves criminal intent," she said finally. "Your husband knew the foundations were inadequate and ordered the engineers to approve them anyway." The word criminal hit me like a physical blow. I'd spent 3 weeks hoping the investigation would reveal Leonard as misguided rather than malicious, careless rather than criminal. This document destroyed those hopes completely. "There's more," Nina continued, producing another memorandum from the Morrison files. This one's from 2020. Regarding the structural steel specifications for the Riverside Commercial Complex, the second document was even more damning. Leonard had specifically requested that steel reinforcement calculations be reduced by 15% to save money, despite Morrison's warnings that the reductions would compromise seismic safety standards. Again, there was a handwritten note documenting Leonard's decision to accept reduced safety margins to meet budget requirements. I felt sick. Not just disappointed or angry, but physically nauseated by the evidence of Leonard's deliberate disregard for public safety. These weren't mistakes or oversights. They were calculated decisions to prioritize profits over the lives of people who would live and work in his buildings. "How many other projects have similar documentation?" I asked weakly. Nina's expression was sympathetic but professional. "We're still reviewing files, but it appears this was Leonard's standard practice." Morrison and Associates documented his instructions to reduce safety specifications on at least 8 different projects. 8 projects. Hundreds of families living in structurally compromised buildings because my husband had decided their safety was less important than his profit margins. I drove home that evening in a daze, my mind reeling from the discovery that Leonard wasn't just guilty of negligence, he was guilty of criminal conspiracy to endanger public safety. The man I'd lived with for 50 years had spent the last decade systematically corrupting engineering standards to maximize his business profits. Leonard was waiting for me in his office when I arrived home, surrounded by legal documents and wearing the haggard expression of someone who'd been making desperate phone calls all day. "The Morrison firm is trying to throw me under the bus," he said without preamble. "They're claiming I pressured them to approve substandard engineering specifications." I stared at him, wondering if he would admit the truth or continue pretending. He'd been misled by incompetent engineers. Is that what happened? I asked directly. Leonard's pause lasted long enough to be an answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a defeated tone I'd never heard before. I made business decisions based on practical considerations. Engineering firms always want to over-design structures, add unnecessary safety margins, conduct expensive testing that doesn't change the fundamental structural requirements. He looked up at me with desperate eyes. I streamlined the process to eliminate redundant precautions. The clinical language couldn't disguise what he was describing. Leonard had pressured engineers to reduce safety specifications, ignored their professional warnings, and documented his instructions to proceed with structures he knew were inadequately designed. Leonard, people could have died, I said quietly, but they didn't, he replied quickly. The Meridian Heights collapse happened in the middle of the night when the affected units were empty. No one was hurt. That was luck, not planning. If the collapse had happened during daytime, or if it had triggered a complete structural failure... I couldn't finish the sentence. Leonard stood up and walked to his desk, opening a drawer that contained documents I'd never seen before. He pulled out a folder marked Confidential Engineering Modifications and set it on the desk between us. You want to know the truth? He said, the truth is that engineering firms pad their specifications with excessive safety margins because they're afraid of liability. Building codes require certain minimums, but engineers routinely exceed those minimums by 50 or 60% to protect themselves from lawsuits. I opened the folder and found detailed correspondence between Leonard and Morrison and Associates, documenting years of negotiations about engineering specifications. Leonard had systematically pressured the firm to reduce their safety recommendations, arguing that code minimums were adequate for structural integrity. You're not an engineer, I said. You don't have the expertise to determine whether safety margins are excessive or necessary. I have 40 years of real estate development experience. Leonard replied, I know the difference between essential structural requirements and engineering overkill. The arrogance in his voice was breathtaking. Leonard had convinced himself that his business experience qualified him to override professional engineering judgment on matters of public safety, but the most shocking discovery was yet to come. At the bottom of the folder was a single document that made everything else seem trivial by comparison. It was a professional engineering license application form filled out in Leonard's handwriting and dated 3 months ago. He'd been applying for emergency professional engineering credentials that would allow him to certify his own structural specifications. You were trying to get an engineering license? I asked, incredulous. Leonard's face flushed. I needed official certification authority to resolve some regulatory issues with the investigation. If I could demonstrate professional engineering competency, it would strengthen our legal position. I stared at the application form, trying to process what Leonard was telling me. He'd been planning to circumvent professional engineering oversight by obtaining credentials he wasn't qualified to hold. Leonard, you don't have engineering education or training. This application would be fraudulent. I have decades of practical experience with structural design. I understand building requirements. As well as any engineer, the delusion was complete. Leonard had convinced himself that business experience was equivalent to professional engineering training, that financial success qualified him to override safety standards, that his judgment was more reliable than professional engineering analysis. The application was rejected, he admitted. The licensing board requires actual engineering education and examination. I felt a cold clarity settle over me as I understood the full scope of Leonard's deception. He hadn't just pressured engineers to reduce safety specifications. He tried to obtain fraudulent professional credentials to bypass engineering oversight entirely. But there's another option, Leonard continued, his voice carrying a desperate hope that made my stomach clench. You have current engineering credentials. Your license is valid and your continuing education is up to date. I knew what he was going to ask before he said it. I need you to retroactively certify the structural specifications for my recent projects. As my wife and a licensed engineer, you could sign off on the engineering adequacy of buildings that are under investigation. The request was so outrageous, it took me several seconds to respond. You want me to falsely certify structures I know are inadequately engineered? I want you to use your professional authority to confirm that my buildings meet acceptable structural standards. They don't meet acceptable structural standards, Leonard. That's why one of them collapsed. Leonard leaned forward across the desk, his eyes pleading. Yuko, I'm facing criminal charges and financial ruin. Our family's entire future depends on resolving this investigation. You're the only person who can provide the professional certification needed to demonstrate engineering compliance. I looked at this man I'd married, this person who dismissed my expertise for 30 years and now wanted me to prostitute that same expertise to save him from the consequences of ignoring professional engineering standards. The choice was stark and final. I could save Leonard by destroying my professional integrity, or I could preserve my ethics by allowing him to face accountability for his actions. For the first time in our marriage, the decision was easy. No, I said simply, I will not falsify engineering certifications. Leonard's face crumpled as he realized his last hope had just disappeared. The formal criminal charges were filed on a Wednesday morning in November, delivered to our house by a sheriff's deputy who looked young enough to be Devon's son. Leonard signed for the documents with shaking hands, his face grey as November sky. 3 counts of criminal negligence, 2 counts of reckless endangerment, and 1 count of conspiracy to defraud building safety inspections. Maya had prepared us for this moment, but the reality of seeing Leonard's name on criminal indictments felt surreal. The man who'd built a 40-year reputation as a successful developer was now facing the possibility of spending his final years in federal prison. The preliminary hearing is scheduled for next month, Maya explained as we sat in our kitchen reviewing the charges. The prosecution has to present evidence that supports probable cause for trial. Leonard hadn't spoken since the deputy left. He sat at our kitchen table staring at the legal documents like they were written in a foreign language. Devon arrived that afternoon with more devastating news. The company's board of directors voted to suspend you from all operational responsibilities, he told Leonard. The insurance companies are refusing to provide legal defense coverage, and 3 major investor groups have filed motions to freeze company assets. The empire Leonard had built was collapsing as systematically as his inadequately engineered buildings. 40 years of business relationships were evaporating as former partners distanced themselves from potential criminal liability. What about the other projects? Leonard asked weakly. The buildings that haven't failed yet. Devon's expression was grim. The city has ordered structural inspections for every building Morrison and Associates engineered in the past 5 years. If they find similar deficiencies, we'll be facing additional lawsuits and potential criminal charges for each project. I'd been dreading this conversation. My work with the investigation team had revealed engineering problems in 7 of Leonard's recent developments. The Meridian Heights collapse was just the most dramatic failure of a pattern that extended across his entire business portfolio. How many buildings are we talking about? Maya asked. 14 residential complexes, 6 commercial developments, and 3 mixed-use projects, I said quietly. 23 buildings total, housing approximately 4,000 residents and employing another 1,500 people. The numbers hung in the air like a death sentence. Leonard wasn't just facing prosecution for 1 collapsed building. He was potentially responsible for endangering the safety of thousands of people who lived and worked in structures he'd knowingly compromised. That evening, Leonard disappeared into his office and didn't emerge for dinner. I found him hours later, sitting in darkness with a glass of whiskey and a photograph from our wedding day. The young couple in the picture looked impossibly optimistic, standing together in front of the church, where we'd promised to support each other through whatever challenges life might bring. I never meant for anyone to get hurt, he said without looking up. I thought I was making smart business decisions. I sat down across from him, studying this man. I'd shared a life with for 50 years. You pressured engineers to ignore safety recommendations. Leonard, you documented your instructions to reduce structural specifications despite professional warnings about the risks. I was trying to build affordable housing, he said defensively. Engineering firms wanted to add expensive modifications that would have priced working families out of the market. The rationalization was pathetic. Leonard's developments had never been marketed as affordable housing. They were luxury properties designed for affluent buyers who could afford premium prices. The Meridian Heights condominiums were selling for $600,000 each, I pointed out. You weren't building affordable housing, you were maximizing profit margins. Leonard's silence acknowledged the truth. He couldn't defend. My phone rang at 9 o'clock. Nina Morales calling with an update from the investigation team. We've completed preliminary structural analysis on 6 more properties, she reported. All of them show significant engineering deficiencies similar to Meridian Heights. How significant? I asked, though I dreaded the answer. 2 buildings require immediate evacuation. The others need extensive structural retrofitting to meet basic safety standards. Nina's voice carried professional composure, but I could hear the underlying anger. We're talking about tens of millions of dollars in repairs and potential lawsuits from hundreds of displaced residents. After I hung up, Leonard was staring at me with desperate hope. What did she say? I told him about the additional building failures, watching his face crumble as he absorbed the scope of the disaster he'd created. 23 buildings with compromised structural integrity. Thousands of people living in potentially dangerous conditions. Hundreds of millions of dollars in potential liability. There has to be something we can do, he said desperately. Some way to fix this without destroying everything we've built. I looked at Leonard with a mixture of pity and frustration, even. Now, facing criminal charges and financial ruin, he was thinking in terms of protecting his business empire, rather than accepting responsibility for endangering public safety. The only thing we can do is ensure those buildings are properly repaired, and the people affected are compensated for their losses, I said. Everything else is secondary to public safety. Leonard's face twisted with anguish. Easy to say when it's not your life's work being destroyed. It's not my life's work, I replied firmly. It's yours, and you destroyed it yourself when you decided profit margins were more important than structural integrity. The next morning brought more devastating news. Maya called before sunrise with word that the district attorney's office was expanding the investigation to include potential charges of fraud and conspiracy. If Leonard had knowingly misrepresented building safety to investors or buyers, he could face additional federal charges with longer prison sentences. They're also investigating the engineering firm, Maya reported. Morrison and Associates could face criminal charges for professional negligence and conspiracy to defraud building inspections. The net was tight, running around everyone involved in the systematic engineering failures. Leonard's attempt to save money by cutting safety corners had created a criminal conspiracy that could destroy multiple lives and businesses. Devon arrived that afternoon with the most painful news yet. The company employees are asking whether they'll have jobs next month, he said. We employ 47 people, and most of them have families depending on company income. I watched Leonard absorb the human cost of his decisions. 47 employees whose livelihoods depended on a business facing criminal investigation and potential bankruptcy. Their children, mortgages, health insurance, and retirement plans were all threatened by Leonard's decision to compromise engineering standards. What do I tell them? Devon asked. Leonard stared out our kitchen window at the garden I'd designed and maintained. The one space where engineering principles had been applied correctly and safely. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. Tell them the truth. Tell them their jobs probably won't survive the criminal investigation. That evening, I found Leonard in his office again, this time studying architectural drawings from his early projects. These were buildings from the 1980s and 1990s, constructed before he'd started pressuring engineers to reduce safety specifications. Remember the Riverside Elementary School edition? He asked, pointing to blueprints from 1987 you reviewed. Those structural plans and caught the error in the beam calculations. I remembered. The school district's architect had miscalculated load requirements for the cafeteria addition, and I'd spotted the problem during a casual review of the plans Leonard had brought home. My correction had prevented a potential structural failure. That could have injured children. You saved that project, Leonard continued. Your engineering expertise prevented a disaster. I studied the blueprints, remembering how proud I'd felt to contribute my professional knowledge to something meaningful. But I also remembered Leonard's reaction when I'd pointed out the error. He'd been grateful but dismissive, treating my insight as lucky coincidence rather than professional competence. Why didn't you listen to me more often? I asked, why did you stop valuing my engineering expertise? Leonard's pause lasted so long, I thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a vulnerability I hadn't heard in decades. Because listening to you would have meant admitting I needed help. Because asking for your professional input would have acknowledged that you knew things I didn't. He looked up at me with haunted eyes. Because I was too proud to share credit. For my success, the admission was 50 years overdue, but it carried the weight of truth. Leonard had built his empire by excluding others from decision-making authority, particularly his wife, whose expertise might have challenged his judgment or diminished his sense of control. Now that empire was crumbling, and the expertise he dismissed for decades represented his only hope for understanding the scope of his crisis. I need your help, he said simply. Not to falsify reports or minimize the engineering problems, but to help me understand what needs to be fixed and how to fix it responsibly. I looked at this broken man who'd spent 30 years dismissing my professional knowledge and was finally asking for help when it was too late to prevent disaster. The question was whether helping him now would serve justice or enable further harm. The preliminary hearing took place in a federal courthouse downtown. In a courtroom I remembered from my brief career testifying as an expert witness in construction disputes. 30 years later, I was back in the same role, but this time testifying against my own husband. Leonard sat at the defendant's table with Maya and two criminal defense attorneys, his hands folded in his lap, looking smaller than I'd ever seen. Him, the man who'd commanded boardrooms and dominated business meetings, had been reduced to a fried and elderly defendant facing potential prison time. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. They presented evidence of Leonard's systematic pressure on Morrison and associates to reduce safety specifications, documented his explicit instructions to ignore engineering recommendations, and detailed the resulting structural failures across multiple buildings. When they called me to testify, I walked to the witness stand feeling the weight of 50 years of marriage and 30 years of suppressed professional expertise. The prosecutor, a sharp woman in her 40s named Sarah Chen, guided me through my credentials and background before focusing on the technical aspects of Leonard's building failures. Dr. Oslowick, based on your engineering analysis, were the structural failures at Meridian Heights preventable? I looked at Leonard before answering, seeing him lean forward with desperate hope that I might somehow minimize the damage. Then I looked at the gallery filled with displaced residents, building inspectors, and journalists documenting the proceedings. Yes, I said clearly, the structural failures were entirely preventable with proper engineering analysis and appropriate safety specifications. In your professional opinion, why didn't that proper engineering analysis occur? Because the client, my husband, explicitly instructed the engineering firm to reduce safety specifications to save money and accelerate construction timelines. Leonard flinched as if I'd struck him. Maya closed her eyes, the courtroom murmured. With the sound of reporters scribbling notes, Prosecutor Chen continued. Were you aware of these instructions to reduce safety specifications while they were occurring? No, my husband excluded me from business discussions despite my professional engineering credentials. I learned about these practices only during the investigation following the building collapse. If you had been consulted during the engineering phase, would you have approved these reduced safety specifications? I met Leonard's eyes across the courtroom. Absolutely not. The specifications he approved were inadequate for the soil conditions and structural loads involved. Any competent structural engineer would have rejected them immediately. The defense attorney, a silver-haired man named Robert Kane, tried to minimize the damage during cross-examination. He emphasized my lack of recent professional practice and suggested that building codes had changed significantly since my active career. Dr. Oslowick, you haven't worked as a practicing engineer in over 20 years. How can you be certain your knowledge is current? I've maintained my professional license through continuous education requirements, I replied. I've completed over 600 hours of continuing education in the past decade, focusing specifically on seismic engineering and building safety standards. Kane looked surprised. 600 hours over 10 years. The licensing requirement is 40 hours per 2-year period. I completed more than 7 times the minimum requirement because I wanted to maintain current knowledge in case my expertise was ever needed. Kane paused, realizing his question had backfired. Instead of highlighting my outdated knowledge, he documented my extraordinary commitment to staying current with engineering standards. Dr. Oslowick. As the defendant's wife, don't you have a personal interest in minimizing his culpability? I looked at Leonard again, this man I'd loved and supported through 40 years of marriage. The man who dismissed my expertise, excluded me from professional discussions, and ultimately created the crisis that brought us to this courtroom. Mr. Kane, my personal interests are irrelevant. My professional obligation as a licensed engineer is to provide accurate technical analysis regardless of personal relationships. The buildings my husband constructed with reduced safety specifications are dangerous to the people who live and work in them. That fact doesn't change because he's my husband. The courtroom fell silent. Leonard stared at me with an expression of complete devastation, finally understanding that I would not compromise my professional integrity to protect him from accountability. When court recessed for lunch, Maya approached me in the hallway outside the courtroom. Mom, I understand your position, but you just guaranteed Dad will be convicted. I guaranteed that the court will have accurate engineering analysis, I corrected. What happens to your father depends on the choices he made, not the testimony I provide. Devon was waiting for me near the courthouse entrance, his face pale with stress. Mom, is there any way to present the engineering problems as honest mistakes rather than deliberate negligence? I studied my son, this gentleman who'd inherited Leonard's business ambition but my ethical sensibilities. Devon, 14 buildings with compromised structural integrity isn't an honest mistake. It's a pattern of deliberate corner-cutting that endangered thousands of people. But if Dad goes to prison, what happens to the company? What happens to the employees and their families? The question carried the weight of real human consequences. Leonard's crimes hadn't been committed in isolation. They affected company employees, building residents, investors, and countless others whose lives were connected to his business empire. The company assets will probably be liquidated to pay for building repairs and victim compensation, I said. Honestly, the employees will lose their jobs. The investors will lose their money. People who bought condominiums in unsafe buildings will face massive financial losses. Devon's eyes filled with tears. All because Dad wanted to save money on engineering. All because your father chose profit over safety, I corrected gently. The consequences are severe because the decisions that created them were dangerous. That afternoon, the prosecution called Nina Morales to testify about the broader investigation. She detailed the engineering deficiencies found in Leonard's other buildings, the number of residents who'd been evacuated from unsafe structures, and the estimated cost of repairs needed to bring the buildings up to safety standards. Inspector Morales, in your professional opinion, how many people were endangered by the defendant's decision to reduce structural safety specifications? Nina consulted her notes. Approximately 4,000 residents in residential buildings, 1,500 employees in commercial structures, and an additional 800 people who visit or work in the affected buildings regularly, total. Potential casualties could have exceeded 6,000 people if multiple buildings had experienced catastrophic structural failure. 6,000 people. The number reverberated through the courtroom like a physical blow. Leonard had gambled with the lives of 6,000 people to increase his profit margins. The prosecution's final witness was Dr. Margaret Forster, a seismic engineering professor from the State University and one of the leading experts on structural failure analysis. She explained in clear, non-technical language how Leonard's reduced safety specifications had created the conditions for the Meridian Heights collapse. In layman's terms, Dr. Forster, what would have happened if the Meridian Heights building had experienced a more severe seismic event? Dr. Forster's answer was chilling: complete structural collapse. The building would have pancaked, potentially killing everyone inside and causing massive casualties in surrounding buildings. Leonard buried his face in his hands. Maya leaned over to comfort him, but there was no comfort available for someone who'd narrowly avoided causing a mass casualty disaster through deliberate negligence. When court adjourned for the day, I found Leonard sitting alone in his car in the courthouse parking garage. He looked up when I knocked on his window, his face streaked with tears. "Get in," he said quietly. I sat in the passenger seat of the car where we'd shared countless conversations over 5 decades of marriage. The silence stretched between us like a chasm that had been building for 30 years. "I'm going to prison," Leonard said, finally. "Probably. The company is finished." "Yes. Our family will never recover from this." I considered his words carefully. "Our family will recover from your choices, Leonard. But it will take time, and it will require acknowledging the full extent of what you did." Leonard turned to look at me directly. "Do you hate me?" The question cut through years of accumulated anger, disappointment, and frustration. I thought about the young man I'd married, the partner who'd once respected my intelligence, the person who'd gotten lost somewhere in the pursuit of success and recognition. "I hate what you did," I said slowly. "I hate that you endangered innocent people. I hate that you dismissed my expertise for 30 years and then expected me to compromise my integrity to save you." I paused, feeling the truth settle between us. "But I don't hate you, Leonard. I'm just profoundly disappointed in who you became." We sat in silence for several more minutes before Leonard started the car. "The judge will probably sentence me next month," he said as we drove home. "Maya thinks I'm looking at 10 to 15 years. At 76, a 10-year sentence was effectively a life sentence." Leonard would die in federal prison, his reputation destroyed, his empire in ruins. "What will you do?" he asked. I'd been thinking about that question for weeks. "I'm going to help coordinate the building repairs and victim compensation. The city has asked me to serve as an independent engineering consultant to ensure the structural Work is done properly. Leonard glanced at me with surprise. You going back to work? I never really stopped working, Leonard. I just stopped being allowed to use my expertise professionally. When we reached our house, Leonard walked straight to his office and closed the door. I found him there hours later, drafting letters to each employee who would lose their job because of his criminal actions. The preliminary hearing had lasted 1 day, but it had taken 50 years to reach this moment of reckoning. Leonard's empire was ending not with celebration or success, but with criminal conviction and the knowledge that his pursuit of profit over safety had nearly caused a mass casualty disaster. Justice was being served, but it tasted like ashes in my mouth. Leonard was sentenced on a cold February morning 6 months after the preliminary hearing. The federal judge, an elderly woman named Margaret Sullivan, had reviewed every document in the case and heard testimony from dozens of victims whose lives had been disrupted by his unsafe buildings. Mr. Oslowick, Judge Sullivan said, "Your decision to prioritize profit over public safety represents one of the most egregious cases of criminal negligence this court has encountered. You knowingly endangered thousands of innocent people to increase your business profits." Leonard stood at the defendant's table wearing the grey suit he'd worn to our wedding 50 years earlier, his hands shaking as Judge Sullivan pronounced his sentence, 12 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised probation, and restitution totaling $47 million for building repairs and victim compensation. At 76, Leonard would be 88 when released, assuming he survived his incarceration. The empire he'd spent 40 years building would be liquidated to pay for the damage his negligence had caused. Maya stood beside him as the sentence was read, her face composed despite the tears streaming down her cheeks. Devon sat in the gallery behind us, holding his wife's hand and trying to comfort their teenage children who were watching their grandfather led away in handcuffs. I felt surprisingly empty as the bailiff guided Leonard toward the door. 50 years of marriage ending not with death or divorce, but with criminal conviction for endangering the public safety. The young couple in our wedding photos could never have imagined this moment, but beneath this sadness was something else. Relief. Relief that Leonard's dangerous practices had been stopped before anyone was killed. Relief that the victims would receive compensation and the unsafe buildings would be properly repaired. Relief that I'd finally chosen professional integrity over family loyalty when the choice mattered most. The aftermath of Leonard's conviction played out over the following months like a slow-motion avalanche. The company was dissolved, its assets ceased to pay restitution. The 47 employees lost their jobs, though several were hired by competing firms once their lack of involvement in Leonard's criminal practices was established. Morrison and Associates was prosecuted separately, with the firm's principals receiving shorter prison sentences and professional license revocations. The firm was dissolved and its assets also seized for victim compensation. The damaged buildings were extensively renovated under my supervision as the court-appointed engineering consultant. Working with teams of younger engineers, I designed structural modifications that brought every building up to current safety standards. The work took 2 years and cost $38 million, but it guaranteed that the residents could return to structurally sound homes. The experience of returning to professional engineering practice at 74 was both exhilarating and challenging. My knowledge was current thanks to decades of continuing education, but translating that knowledge into practical applications required relearning skills I hadn't used professionally in 30 years. The younger engineers I worked with treated me with respect that Leonard had never shown. They valued my insights about seismic engineering and soil analysis, asked thoughtful questions about my recommendations, and implemented my suggestions without questioning my competence. For the first time in 3 decades, I felt like a professional engineer rather than someone who used to be an engineer. Maya handled the legal aspects of the company dissolution and victim compensation, working 18-hour days to ensure fair distribution of available assets. The process was complicated by Leonard's attempts to hide assets offshore, but Maya's tenacity eventually uncovered most of his concealed wealth. He tried to protect family money by transferring it to shell companies, Maya explained during one of our weekly dinners. But those transfers occurred after the criminal investigation began, so they're considered fraudulent attempts to avoid restitution obligations. Devon struggled more with the aftermath. He'd worked for his father's company for 15 years, believing he was part of a legitimate business enterprise. Learning about Leonard's systematic safety violations felt like a personal betrayal that shook his faith in his own judgment. I should have known, he told me repeatedly. I should have questioned the course-cutting measures and engineering shortcuts. You weren't an engineer, I reminded him. You couldn't have recognized technical problems that required professional expertise to identify, but you would have recognized them if Dad had ever asked for your input. That truth hung between us. Like a weight. I would have recognized the engineering problems immediately if Leonard had included me in business discussions. My expertise could have prevented the building failures, the criminal prosecution, and the destruction of everything he'd worked to build. But Leonard had chosen to exclude me from decisions where my knowledge was most valuable, preferring to maintain complete control rather than acknowledge my professional competence. The most difficult part of the aftermath was visiting Leonard in federal prison. The facility was a 3-hour drive from our house, a low-security institution for white-collar criminals that looked more like a college campus than a traditional prison. Leonard had aged dramatically during his first year of incarceration. His hair had gone completely white. His face was deeply lined, and he'd lost 30 pounds. The confident businessman who dominated every room he entered had been replaced by a frail elderly man wearing prison-issued clothing. How are the building repairs progressing? He asked during my first visit. I updated him on the structural modifications, the timeline for completion, and the satisfaction of residents who'd been able to return to safe homes. Leonard listened without interrupting, occasionally asking technical questions that demonstrated his genuine interest in ensuring the work was done properly. I'm glad you're overseeing the engineering, he said finally. You'll make sure it's done right. The acknowledgement was 40 years overdue, but it felt genuine. Leonard finally understood that my professional expertise was valuable, even though he'd learned that lesson too late to prevent disaster. I've been thinking about our early years, he continued, before I started excluding you from business decisions. You were my best advisor back then. I remembered those early years when Leonard would bring building plans home and ask for my opinions about structural elements and design efficiency. My suggestions had improved several of his projects, but as his business grew, he'd gradually stop seeking my input. When did you stop trusting my judgment? I asked. Leonard considered the question carefully. I think it was when other developers started treating me as a serious player in the business. Acknowledging that my wife was giving me engineering advice made me feel like I wasn't competent to succeed on my own. The explanation was honest, but painful. Leonard had sacrificed our professional partnership to protect his ego, preferring to make inferior decisions independently rather than better decisions collaboratively. I'm sorry, he said quietly. I'm sorry I wasted your expertise. I'm sorry I endangered innocent people. I'm sorry I destroyed everything we built together. The apology felt sincere, but it couldn't undo 30 years of dismissal or erase the consequences of his criminal negligence. Leonard's remorse was real, but it was also irrelevant to the victims who'd lost their homes or the families whose lives had been disrupted by his dangerous buildings. What will you do when you get out? I asked. Leonard's laugh was bitter. If I get out, I'll be 88 years old, assuming I survived 12 years in here. I'll probably spend my final years in assisted living. If I'm lucky, the conversation felt like closure for a marriage that had ended the moment Leonard asked me to falsify engineering reports. We'd shared 50 years of life together, but the partnership had been fundamentally unequal from the beginning. Leonard had seen himself as the primary breadwinner and decision-maker, while I was supposed to provide support and domestic management. My professional expertise had been treated as a hobby rather than a valuable asset, acknowledged only when it was convenient and dismissed when it might challenge his authority. Now, at 74, I was finally free to use my engineering knowledge, without seeking Leonard's approval or enduring his condescension. The city had offered me a permanent position as a consulting engineer for structural safety inspections, and I'd accepted with enthusiasm. The work was demanding but deeply satisfying. I reviewed building plans for new construction projects, inspected existing structures for safety compliance, and provided technical guidance for seismic retrofitting programs. My age was occasionally questioned by young developers, but my competence quickly established credibility. Maya and Devon both encouraged my return to professional practice. They'd watched their mother's expertise get marginalized for decades and were proud to see me finally getting recognition for my knowledge and skills. "You're happier now than I've seen you in years," Maya observed during one of our lunches. Despite everything that's happened with Dad, she was right. The destruction of Leonard's empire and our marriage had freed me to reclaim an identity I'd abandoned for 30 years. I was a structural engineer again, not just someone who used to be an engineer. The house felt different without Leonard's presence. Quieter, certainly, but also more peaceful. I'd rearranged his office into a proper engineering workspace, installing drafting tables and technical reference materials. The space where Leonard had plotted his criminal course-cutting measures became the place where I designed safety improvements for other people's buildings. Kumar, my elderly Shiba Inu, had adapted to Leonard's absence with typical canine resilience. She followed me around the house and garden, providing companionship without judgment or demands. Animals understood loyalty without requiring the sacrifice of personal integrity. The garden remained my sanctuary, but it had evolved from a place of retreat into a laboratory for testing engineering principles on a small scale. I'd added a greenhouse where I grew vegetables using hydroponic systems that incorporated structural engineering concepts. The precision and problem-solving aspects of gardening satisfied the same mental processes that made me effective as an engineer. 2 years after Leonard's conviction, I received an unexpected phone call from the dean of the engineering school at the State University. They were looking for adjunct faculty to teach a course on practical structural engineering for graduate students. "We need someone with real-world experience who can bridge the gap between theoretical knowledge and practical application," the dean explained. "Your background in seismic engineering and recent work on the building renovation project makes you an ideal candidate." Teaching engineering felt like coming full circle. I'd spent 30 years learning to suppress my expertise, and now I was being asked to share it with the next generation of professional engineers. My first lecture was intimidating. Standing in front of 30 graduate students, most of them young enough to be my grandchildren, I felt ancient and out of place. But as I began explaining the relationship between soil conditions and foundation design, using the Meridian Heights collapse as a case study, the familiar confidence of professional competence returned. The students were engaged and respectful, asking thoughtful questions about load calculations and safety margins. They treated me as an expert whose knowledge was valuable, not as an elderly woman whose opinions could be dismissed. One student stayed after class to ask about my experience returning to professional practice after a long hiatus. "My mother is a civil engineer who stopped working when I was born," she explained. "She's been thinking about returning to the field, but she's worried her knowledge is outdated." I thought about Leonard's decades of discouragement, the professional confidence I'd lost through disuse, and the satisfaction of reclaiming my engineering identity at 74. Tell your mother that engineering principles don't become obsolete, I said. Technology evolves and codes get updated, but the fundamental physics of structural integrity remains constant. If she maintains her curiosity and willingness to learn, she can absolutely return to professional practice. The student smiled. That's what she hoped to hear. Walking across campus after my lecture, I felt the winter sun warming my face and remembered the young woman who'd earned her engineering degree 50 years earlier. She'd dreamed of designing bridges and buildings that would serve communities for generations. I never built the bridges I'd planned in my youth, but I'd spent the last 2 years ensuring that 23 buildings would be safe for the people who lived and worked in them. I'd helped train young engineers who would go on to design structures that prioritized safety over profit. I'd finally chosen professional integrity over personal convenience when the choice mattered most. Leonard would spend the next decade in prison, paying for his decision to prioritize profit over public safety. Our marriage was over, our family forever changed. His empire reduced to liquidation proceeds that barely covered the damage his negligence had caused. But I was finally, authentically, myself again. At 74, I'd reclaimed the professional identity I'd abandoned for 30 years. I was Dr. Yuko Oslowick, structural engineer, and no one would ever dismiss my expertise again. The afternoon light slanted through the engineering building windows as I gathered my teaching materials, already looking forward to next week's lecture. On seismic retrofitting techniques, I had decades of knowledge to share and students eager to learn. For the first time in 30 years, my future felt like it belonged to me. The wind carried the scent of damp soil as I stepped into the backyard garden I had spent decades perfecting my refuge from invisibility. Kneeling near the terrace slope I engineered years ago to protect our foundation from runoff, I didn't feel the weight of 76 years. My body ached, but my mind was sharp, invigorated not by the silence of retirement, but the rhythm of relevance returning. It had been nearly a year since Leonard was sentenced. 12 years in federal prison. His lawyers had argued for leniency based on age and health, but the judge remained firm. A legacy built on knowingly endangering thousands couldn't go unpunished. The court called it criminal negligence. I called it predictable hubris. I hadn't spoken to Leonard since the day I testified. He didn't try to contact me after sentencing, and I didn't offer the comfort of a goodbye. We had said our last words as husband and wife long before the gavel struck wood. But even now, in this quiet morning, echoes of that courtroom still followed me. Not just the questions and testimony, but the feeling of standing upright after decades of being bent in word. I paused beside a small retaining wall I'd built from natural stone and let my fingers run along the edge. I had designed it during a time when Leonard still referred to my work as cute, like it belonged on a refrigerator door, not in architectural blueprints. He'd never grasped the load-bearing calculations behind it or the intentionality of its curve, but it held. That wall never cracked, never bowed, never buckled, not even in the winter thaw. Unlike Leonard's buildings. 2 weeks after the sentencing, the mayor's office called. Not a secretary, not a spokesperson, the mayor herself, Dr. Oslowick, she began formally. We'd like you to sit on the city's Structural Safety and Integrity Advisory Board. I remember staring at the phone in silence. It's a new position, oversight, independence, someone with your background, your history. We think you'd bring an ethical lens and the technical understanding we need now more than ever. I agreed before the call ended, not because I wanted redemption, but because I was done sitting quietly on the sidelines while others gambled with lives and called it business. At our first meeting, a younger board member glanced at my resume and raised an eyebrow. You haven't practiced professionally in over 2 decades, he said. I smiled gently, then handed him a sealed packet of the investigation documents I had helped prepare. Soil analysis, load-bearing simulations, testimonies. His eyes widened as he read my annotations in the margins. He said nothing else for the rest of the meeting. Respect is earned, but for women of a certain age, it often requires a sledgehammer of proof. My son hadn't returned to real estate. He turned in his company keys the day after Leonard was arrested and never looked back. But Devon wasn't aimless. He found a new path less lucrative, more meaningful. He started volunteering for a non-profit that rebuilt unsafe housing in underserved communities. After 6 months, he joined full-time. He didn't want leadership, not again. He wanted his hands on real materials, his mind on tangible problems. For once, he didn't have to sell anything. He only had to build. One afternoon, he brought blueprints home for a low-income apartment building his organization was retrofitting. He spread them out on my kitchen table, the same table where Leonard had once silenced my voice. Would you take a look? Devon asked. I want a second pair of eyes. Someone I trust. That single sentence softened something deep inside me. For years, I had yearned for recognition not in headlines or accolades, but in these quiet acts of respect. We spent the entire evening revising structural diagrams, optimizing support placement, and improving energy efficiency. The joy in his eyes wasn't just from solving problems, it was from discovering a part of me he'd only vaguely known as a child. Devon didn't just see his mother now, he saw an engineer. Maya, ever the fighter, had channeled her fury into legal reform. She'd taken a leave of absence from her private firm and was working pro bono on a task force for legislative change. Their goal, to create stricter penalties for developers who knowingly bypass safety recommendations and to empower engineers with more legal authority to report ethical violations. One night over dinner, she said, "Do you realize what you did in that courtroom, Mom? You didn't just help convict Dad. You redefined what accountability looks like in our field." I shook my head. I didn't redefine anything. I just told the truth. Exactly, Maya said. And that's what makes it powerful. She asked if I'd testify before the state senate when her task force presented its reform proposal. I agreed. Speaking out once had cost me a marriage, but restored a profession. Speaking again could prevent future tragedies. That was worth every syllable. To my surprise, the public didn't vilify me for testifying against my husband. If anything, I became a quiet symbol for the silent experts in every field, people whose warnings were ignored until disaster struck. Women wrote to me from across the country. Architects, chemists, analysts, nurses. One letter stayed with me. My boss said the safety protocol I insisted on was unnecessary paranoia. Your story gave me the courage to push back. 2 weeks later, my department caught a critical flaw in our containment system. People could have died. But they didn't, because I spoke up. I cried after reading it, not because it vindicated me, but because it meant my voice now echoed beyond the courtroom, beyond the garden, into boardrooms and labs and departments filled with women who, like me, had been told to smile and be quiet. Then came the first envelope, postmarked from a federal correctional institution in Indiana. No return address, but the handwriting was unmistakable. I let it sit on the counter for 3 days before opening it. Inside was a single page. Yuko, I don't expect forgiveness. I only ask that you believe. I finally see what I was too arrogant to admit. You were always the better engineer. And I spent our life proving the opposite out of fear. I don't ask for anything more than that. Leonard, there were no apologies for the lives endangered, no requests for favors, no bitter protests. I didn't write back. Not yet. Perhaps not. Ever. But I kept the letter, because as much as the past had broken us, acknowledgement, even late, mattered. not for his sake but for mine. A reminder that I had been right to speak up, even if it took a collapse for someone to finally listen. By late spring, I was lecturing part-time at the university again. Guest sessions at first, then seminars, then, quietly and without fanfare, they offered me an honorary teaching chair in structural safety and integrity. I accepted. On my first day, I walked into a room filled with students half my age. They stared at me like I might talk about history. Instead, I gave them a crash course in modern soil dynamics and foundation drift under seismic stress. No one looked at their phones. I ended that class with a lesson not found in any textbook. The most dangerous failure point in any structure isn't in the material, it's in human decision-making. It's what happens when engineers are silenced, when safety is dismissed, when profit speaks louder than principle. No one forgot that class. I know because they lined up after the bell, not to challenge me, to ask questions. To learn. To listen. The knock on my door came just as I was sketching out load distribution models for a student presentation. It was a brisk February morning, and the sky threatened snow, the kind that blankets the city in silence and demands reflection. When I opened the door, I found a young man in his late 20s, nervously clutching a rolled-up set of blueprints and wearing an expression somewhere between reverence and panic. Dr. Oslowick. He asked. I nodded. I'm Michael Travers. I was one of the junior engineers at Morrison and Associates. He trailed off. Before the collapse. Before the indictments, before the name Morrison became shorthand for negligence. I know who you are, Mr. Travers. Come in. He stepped inside with visible relief, brushing snow from his coat. I gestured toward the kitchen table, the one where I'd once been silenced and now held court. I've been trying to design something better, he said as he unrolled the plans. A community centre, low cost, high safety margin, not flashy. Just sound. I was hoping you might review it. The gesture humbled me more than I expected. After all, this young man had worked under the very firm that disregarded my warnings and empowered Leonard's shortcuts. Yet here he was, offering respect the way I'd always deserved it. Not in apology, but in trust. I studied the blueprints for nearly an hour, offering precise corrections, reinforcement changes here, a deeper footing there, and a redesign of a column base to accommodate soil shift without undermining load capacity. Michael took notes frantically, nodding with a kind of awe I'd once. Imagine Leonard might have shown me if he had only seen me. I learned more from you in an hour than I did in 3 years at Morrison, Michael said as he rolled up the plans again. If you ever considered mentoring formally, I think the entire profession would benefit. The idea took hold like ivy on an old stone wall. I began offering a monthly mentorship seminar for early career engineers free, open door, and grounded in one principle, that ethics and expertise must coexist. No amount of technical brilliance can substitute for courage when it's time to speak up. One evening after a session, a young woman named Aria approached me. She was tall, serious-eyed, and tightly wound in the way of someone who had never been taken seriously enough. My father owns a construction company, she said. He thinks I should stick to accounting. Leave the engineering to the boys, that's what he says. I saw myself in her, or perhaps the version of myself I might have been if I'd spoken out sooner. You know what beams don't do? I asked her. She blinked. They don't care who calculates them, as long as the math is right. Let the boys build their egos. You build the future, she returned every month after that dart. It had been over 2 years since Leonard's sentencing. When the prison chaplain called, Mrs. Oslowick, I'm calling on behalf of your husband. He's asked to see you. My heart didn't race. It didn't ache. It simply thudded with the familiar weight of a decision I had already made a dozen times. I agreed. 3 days later, I stood once again in that federal facility, stark, in its order and routine, where even the air felt regulated. Leonard had visibly shrunk, his face sunken, his hands thinner, but his eyes still restless. He smiled weakly when he saw me. "You look strong." "I am," I replied. We sat across from each other, no glass between us this time, just decades of misused time and love hanging in the sterile air. "I won't ask you to forgive me," he said. "Good," I said plainly. He exhaled a soft, humorless laugh. "I've spent the last year reading every structural manual I could get my hands on," he said, trying to understand what I ignored, what I caused, and I asked, "I've learned more about foundational integrity than I ever cared to when it could have mattered. Turns out, you were right about everything. The admission didn't warm me. It didn't undo anything. But it settled like a stone in calm water, still, but permanent. I ruined everything," he said finally. "Our name, our work, the trust our children had in me." "You didn't ruin me," I said. He looked up, startled. "You diminish me. You dismiss me. But I rebuilt myself without you." We sat in silence for a long moment. Then he asked the one thing I hadn't expected. "Can you tell me about what you're building now?" I told him about the retrofit initiative, about working alongside inspectors to review aging infrastructure. I told him about the mentoring program, the student lectures, and the new committee evaluating engineering firm licensing practices. I told him about the neighbourhood projects I had taken on: small bridges, pedestrian walkways, even a playground that required careful load balance to be safe during winter freeze. And finally, I told him about the foundation I had established, the UCO Foundation for Structural Ethics, named not because I wanted credit, but because I wanted every student who received a scholarship from it to remember that women like me had always existed. Leonard listened without interrupting. "You've done more in the last 2 years than I did in 20, he said softly. "No," I corrected. "You built towers. I'm building trust." One lasts longer. When I returned home from that visit, Devon was waiting on the porch. "How did it go?" he asked. "He's tired," I said. "But he's listening now. Too late, maybe?" "Not for everything," I said. Devon sighed. "I can't bring myself to see him. Not yet. I want to. But he understands," I said. That night, Maya called. She had been offered a judgeship, one of the youngest appointments in the state's history. When she asked if I'd be present at her swearing-in, I said yes, of course, I would stand beside her, not just as her mother, but as a woman who had helped shape the path she was taking. "You taught me how to balance justice and compassion," she said. "I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to live up to that." Spring returned. In a way it hadn't before, in full, unapologetic color. The cherry tree I had planted the year Leonard broke ground on his first office tower bloomed more fully than ever. I took on a special project that season, a small footbridge to connect to parts of a riverside park that had previously been divided by poor urban planning. The city wanted a cheap solution. I offered an elegant one instead, arched with steel reinforcement but panelled in reclaimed wood. The bridge was both a symbol and a function, a place where people could walk, meet, cross, connect. I spent weeks on the calculations, longer on the materials. And one perfect day in June, as I fastened the final tension plate into place, I stepped back and felt it, not pride, but peace. This was my bridge. No one could claim it but me. The letters kept coming. A single mother in New Jersey who enrolled in night school to become a civil engineer. A retiring contractor who said he'd always wondered if he had dismissed the women on his teams too easily. A teenage girl who said she now knew what she wanted: to be an engineer, like Dr. Yuko. I printed every letter, every email, every message. I kept them in a thick binder labeled proof, not proof of my worth. I'd never needed that. Proof that using your voice, even after years of silence, mattered. 1 year after Leonard's sentencing, The city renamed a rebuilt Civic Center auditorium in my honor. They asked me to give a speech. I stood on the stage, back straight, grey, hair swept into a practical bun, hands steady. I am not here because I survived a collapse, I told them. I am here because I refuse to let my silence be my legacy. The room was quiet. I loved someone who chose profit over safety. And I stood up against that choice, not because I stopped loving, but because I finally remembered how to love myself. A standing ovation followed. But that wasn't what moved me. What moved me was Maya, standing in the wings, whispering to Devon, "That's our mom." The last addition to my house wasn't decorative or symbolic. It was structural. The attic had sagged for years, nothing dangerous, just tired framing from the 1950s. I reinforced it myself with sistered beams and a ridge brace. Alone, on a ladder, blueprints nearby, hammer in hand, when I finished, I stood in the quiet space and whispered to no one, "You're safe now." And I wasn't just speaking to the house. Up next we have two more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.